Welcome to round 6. Best of luck to all of you. My name's Hyewan. I'll be your chair. On the panel is Mizuki and Suyeon joining me. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to kick off the debate. Here.
So we have 3 things to deliver from opening government. Firstly, why principally speaking there is no criminality to exposing someone to HIV. Secondly, why criminalization stops or fails to stop the spread of HIV and actually makes it worse. Thirdly, how we manage to address HIV better on our side of the house. Before that, our motto. First, we will not fine, we will not imprison, we will have no criminal sanctions on someone who knowingly delivers HIV to another individual. Second, we believe that suing and resolving these things in public, what do you call it, courts is okay, but we don't think criminal sanctions should be done. Victims, if able to prove that someone with malicious intention did give them HIV, should be able to give some settlement in court. We think we can subsidize lawyers for this, but we don't think that criminal sanctions should be allowed. Thirdly, we will encourage health checks, as we do in status quo. We will maintain awareness campaigns. We will try to make sure that everyone understands that HIV is an illness. It is an illness that currently is closer to being cured than it used to be, and therefore there should be less of a stigma on HIV than there is right now. So let's go into my arguments. Firstly, sit down. Why, on a principle level, is there no criminality to exposing someone to HIV? Now, we think that opposition side needs to be very clear about criminality, right? There are a lot of bad things in this world. You know, lying is bad, bad contracts are bad, all of these things are bad. But we think the line of criminality is very high, right? Because it means that the government is putting a sanction on somebody for their activity. It is extremely invasive on individual liberty. We think that you need a very high standard for criminalizing someone. We think that what happens in the status quo when you single out HIV, which is simply a disease, right? We think that this is supremely unfair. Why? Because in the status quo, no other disease is punished simply for the transmission of it, right? Even if I had influenza and I knew that I did, and I went to school and gave someone to influenza and that person died, I still wouldn't be punished for that person's death despite having this disease, right? We think it is unfair that people with HIV, just because they have HIV, are punished for that. And this is because these people are being punished based on a characteristic that they have, right? So it's like punishing someone for being black, or it's like punishing someone for being LGBT. These people did not ask to be transmitted with HIV. Often it's the case that their parents transmitted it to them before they were born, or that they were transmitted by a partner who they also didn't know had HIV and therefore were affected negatively, right? This is particularly bad as a criminal justice system. Sorry, sit down, I'll take you later. I'll call on you when I want to take you. Criminal justice system, because we think that this means that you're punishing someone based on their characteristics, and that means the criminal justice system is not applied fairly to all individuals, right? Like, the criminal justice system should punish things that everyone can do. Like, I can murder someone, you can murder someone, that's fair and that's equal, so that's why the criminal justice system can punish it. But we think that when you punish someone for having a disease or for a characteristic that they were born with, that's unfair as a criminal justice system, because that's principally punishing someone for something that they are, right? We don't think governments should and can do that. So let's go on secondly to, practically speaking, why is it actually worse that you criminalize this behavior? Before I go on closing.
There's a clear incentive when you knowingly know the possibility that your direct intercourse of sex means exposure of the disease. How is this any more different? How is this any more same to just random diseases?
Okay, so let's talk about right now what happens in the majority of cases when someone transmits HIV to other people, right? Because usually we think that if you have a partner, you want to prevent that person from getting HIV. The majority of human beings are not evil people who want other people to get diseases. We think usually you would say to your partner that you have HIV, you would try to prevent it through condoms, you wouldn't want them to have the same disease, right? So what is the case in which this happens? We think the majority case is in a case of accidents, right? So maybe if you have HIV, you don't want to tell your partner, but you take all preventative measures that you can, right? You put on condoms, you try and make sure that you avoid a lot of things. You might want to eject it beforehand. We think that all of these things might happen, right? But what happens, for example, if the condom rips? Or what happens if the preventative measures didn't work? We think that this is the majority of the time in which these accidents happen. Most of the time, you have no intention to commit this crime, and we think that this is particularly harmful because these people still get punished. We think this is also important because it's really hard to differentiate cases in which there was intention to harm someone and which there wasn't intention to harm someone, right? Because even if there was an accident, it's hard to prove if you didn't tell that person that actually was an accident, right? Now, what you can see, there are sometimes people who are vicious, who want other people to catch HIV, who are also malicious, but we will bite the bullet and say that even though these people exist, it's more important to not attack the people who were unfortunate victims of accidents, but better deal with HIV under our side of the house. But what we want to further say is that this criminalization actually creates perverse incentives, right? Because even if you criminalize it, it doesn't reduce the risk of these accidents happening, it doesn't reduce the risk of people who simply want other people to have HIV and want them also to suffer from trying to transmit this disease. The people who are transmitting this disease, the incentives on their side do not change at all, even if you take this motion, right? We don't think criminalization or like the idea of spending maybe like a year in jail or like this amount of money really changes the minds of these people. But what happens when you criminalize this is that the other people around them, they feel placated, right? They feel that because it's criminalized, HIV holders won't have sex or will tell them if they have HIV. So the majority of people around you will think that because the government is going to punish them and because deterrence is going to work, then they will take less preventative measures, right? Then they will like be less likely to check HIV, and they will also be likely to be victims of this. So we think that criminalization actually creates incentive for the people around to be more like placated and like to think that HIV is not something that is going to happen to them. Which means that the conclusion is that people with HIV will still continue this sexual intercourse regardless, while the people who do not have HIV, who are the victims of this, will actually be harmed because they will no longer take the same preventative measures. And we think this is also worse in terms of like the majority of people who have HIV who don't want to harm other individuals, because for example, if the news is taken up by the media that someone with HIV knowingly transmitted it and it was a crime and these people went to jail, then what happens is there's more stigma on individuals with HIV when there shouldn't be, right? Because these individuals are like the ones who are being harmed right now. So I think the conclusion of all of this argumentation is that practically speaking, it is worse if you criminalize this, and it is better on our side of the house. Because let's talk about how we manage to deal with HIV better on our side. Because what happens with HIV is that, so what we like on our side of the house is that even if someone knowingly transmits HIV to another person, that these people, when this becomes apparent, go to hospitals in order to get treatment, go to like mediation centers in order, if there is a need to mediate between these two individuals, in order to like pay adequate sums of money for care and stuff. We think the government should subsidize the care of these individuals, and what happens there is that these individuals can get the adequate care that they need. And we think that right now people can live with HIV, right? It's not, honestly speaking, as bad as the thing that it was 10 or 20 years ago when it was a disease that you were definitely going to die from. So it's not going to be too harmful or that bad on the individuals who get it, while the government can still help the individuals with this illness, right? So we think that on our side of the house we manage without criminalizing, without labeling the people who have HIV as criminals, to take care of the people who have been harmed, while also taking care and taking like better counseling, for example, for the people who have transmitted this disease. So we think that not criminalizing is on edge better than criminalizing for people with HIV and people without, which is why we're supremely proud to propose this motion.
All right, thank you so much. Inviting the Leader of Opposition, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the injustice inflicted upon you does not justify the injustice you inflict upon others. In fairness, the society or the unfair social structure right now has inflicted upon you does not justify the perpetration that has been committed against other innocent members. That's why we're going to uphold the criminality of knowingly expose your partners to the HIV viruses, as is in the status quo. I'm mainly going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, we'll argue to why there's still a moral culpability in knowingly transmits HIVs to your partners. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why there's legitimate reason for this, because there's also loss of the public goods in the status quo by the transmitting of HIV diseases. That's why it's justified state intervention in deterring people from transmitting HIVs. But thirdly, I'm going to talk about why it's going to further stigmatize sexual minorities in the sense that it doesn't really benefit this kind of embracing narrative that the campaigns and NGOs have been promoting in the status quo. But before that, civil responsive, right? The opening government talks about how they were usually largely transmitted by other people. They're being punished by characteristics that the status quo doesn't really punish people for transmitting other kind of diseases. But the difference is that we need to take different measures for HIVs and other kind of diseases, in the sense that there's different characteristics within HIV viruses or by HIV symptoms to begin with. In the sense that for other diseases, that's usually more visible. I mean, and also for other cases, for example, if you're infected with influenza, you need to take a mask. I mean, you have visible symptoms that can effectively deter people, like, well, make other people aware that you are sick to some extent, to make people be aware of your situations and avoid you to some extent to make sure themselves are safe. In the sense that although for other people are like contagious diseases, also limited people's freedom to choose, freedom to move to begin with, but HIV does not accept limit your ability to freely move and freely to choose what kind of in what way are you going to engage with sexual intercourses with other people. In a sense, the kind of implicit and very subtle nature of the HIV-affected individuals mean that we need to take special actions to prevent the transmission of such kind of diseases. But they also talk about how in the status quo, people are going to take less preventive measures. We were sending out a strong message that they are actually being criminalized. I think that's not true, because the reason that people do not take preventive measures in the status quo are due to a lot of reasons. For example, how intimate you are with other people. We don't really think that whether the state is criminalizing the knowing exposure of to HIV diseases, HIV viruses in the status quo is a significant factor for individuals to calculate whether they're going to take preventive measures, take protections when they're engaged in sexual intercourses in the status quo. To begin with, we first want to characterize to you who exactly are those people who are infected with HIV virus in the status quo. They argue to you they are the people who are mostly oppressed by the status quo. We tell you that it's not true. In the sense that, first of all, the state is legally obliged to provide to keep your information confidential, to minimize the obstacles that you're facing, to seek help to contain the diseases and the symptoms to begin with. But secondly, we also tell you that the state is also providing a lot of positive welfare as well as public provisions, entitlements for you to alleviate your poverty. For example, subsidize your treatment in the status quo. We think all those kind of measures means that the state has already been trying to attempting to revert this kind of social injustice, all this kind of just bad fortune that had happened to individuals by being transmitted by their parents, by their past in the past. Meaning that it's unfair for them to characterize those people who are the most helpless victims to begin with. But secondly, I argue that there's still moral culpability still extends in the case to expose you to a lifelong irreversible harm. In the sense that once you're infected with HIV viruses, that substantially reduce the quality of your life through a irreversible period of relatively long period of time. For example, you have to spend still about $500 or a couple hundreds of dollars a month to spend on cocktail treatment. It shortens your lifespan to a significant amount in the sense that the quality of the life is also going to be reduced. More importantly, you expose other people who do not deserve to. You expose other people to the social stigma, or the social kind of discrimination or disintegration of this kind of unfortunate victims when they do not deserve this to begin with. But secondly, we talk about how this kind of removal of criminal penalty removes a crucial level of deterrence of people to go out and knowingly expose their partners to HIV viruses. In the sense that, first of all, it's going to likely to lead to the increase of public spending on treating those kind of diseases. To begin with, it's also likely to lead to public health crisis within particular communities where the infectious ratio of HIV is particularly high. For example, in some countries that this kind of infectious disease have already the ratio is already about 25%. We think that this kind of reduction of the deterrence that the public criminal justice system has against those people who knowingly expose their partners to this kind of to those kind of danger is particularly harmful. Yes.
Why will criminalization change the incentives of people who have HIV not to transmit these diseases to other people?
Because it sends out strong messages that it's wrong thing, it's morally culpable thing for you to do to begin with. In the sense that people still care about their well-being, right? People still care about the quality of life. I mean, they do not want to pay, for example, a fine to the state or serve for community services, or they do not want to have a life behind the bars, even if they know their life have already been greatly affected by this disease. We mean that individuals have an inherent need to make sure that the harms are not inflicted on them by the state. But more importantly, we think that this policy is going to further stigmatize sexual minorities, which has already been smeared in the status quo by conservative people who opposes the provision of welfare and the promotion of those people's rights of being protected in the status quo. In the sense that you make it even more difficult for build up a positive image of HIV inflicted individuals in the status quo, but before 6 years.
So why would this provide a deterrence, considering when people enter into sexual relationships, they might not consider the full risk and benefits of like getting caught and having.
Well, that's going to be a minority case on both cases, right? We think that on the government side, you're also going to think about there are also people who might or might not consider the potential deterrents that are facing those individuals to begin with. We're talking about majority of the people who are affected by this kind of diseases to rationally calculate the consequences they're going to face by knowingly expose their partners to the danger of being infected with HIV viruses. In a sense, in the status quo, that we are making a clear distinction between those people who are absolutely innocent, who are absolutely most vulnerable against this kind of diseases that are being inflicted upon them against their will, either through their parents or through other kind of partners, by portraying the majority of the HIV-affected individuals as innocent and someone who should be protected and helped by society. And those people, those tend to cross or to overlap with unfortunately, with the sexual minorities, because usually they have to be forced to live an underground life. In a sense that we think it's this, there's enough momentum in the society and the third-party NGOs to promote this kind of campaigns that helps to alleviate their pains and to garner more support for the protection for those. But in this case, you take away that kind of crucial political capital that can effectively protect those people, or make it easier for the opposition, or make it easier for conservatives to smear the image of the sexual minorities. For all those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
All right, thank you so much. Inviting the Deputy Prime Minister.
Two clarifications before moving to substantive from Deputy Prime Minister. First of all, moral culpability is not enough to make individual criminally responsible. We know that they are somehow responsible. They have committed some wrong action by exposing partners to HIV. But it doesn't mean you are criminals. There are many actions that harm the individual, many actions that are socially undesirable. But not all those actions are criminally sanctioned. We told you there's a unique burden for the Cyber House to tell us why this action is criminally responsible for individual that is a burden. And secondly, also criminal sanction shouldn't be used as a way to prevent some social injustice from happening. We told you there's another measure to prevent this, subsidy for HIV patients. We are campaigning for picking up in the medical services. We don't think the criminal sanctions is a unique preventive measure for HIV from spreading. That's why it's not also the reason why we should take their stance. So with that clarified, I want to talk about three clashes in this debate. First of all, I want to talk about which is more just criminal justice system. And secondly, I want to talk about the prevention of HIV spreading. And thirdly, about the protection of rights of HIV holders that they touched in the illegal abortion speech. So firstly, thank you. What means more just criminal justice system? Closing opposition pointed out in point of information by saying that deliberate transmission of disease is different from other random diseases. Also, leader of opposition talking about that. But we believe it's not that different. When you have influenza, for example, when you go to school, you may transmit it in a high possibility for surrounding people. Surrounding may not know if they have flu or if they just are cold. We don't think that those environment is not that different from HIV in the beginning. And in case of HIV, it's not also 100% transmitting disease to other persons. Even without condoms, you don't necessarily transmit disease to other people. That's why in terms of that possibility, in terms of information for surrounding people, it's not that different to begin with. And also, from leader of opposition, their main concern was the quality of life of victims, and there is a massive harm for individuals who are exposed to HIV. But first of all, we admit they have to pay for drugs and take pills every day, but we are happy to subsidize those people to go to the Chicago medical centers. And also, we think in the current status quo, harms to be exposed to HIV are significantly reduced due to the current technology of medical treatment. For example, in the past, AIDS are called the disease of death. That is the past, but we now have the society, the life expectancy of AIDS patients are not that different from non-HIV patients. It's the status quo. That's why I think they are going to the hospital. If they take pills constantly, they don't die at the end of the day. Even though they have some responsibility, they have to take pills, they have to go to hospital. But we think the quality of life diminishing for the HIV patients is not such significant compared to other diseases in the first place. That's why there's no justification to make individual exposing HIV criminally responsible in this particular circumstances. No, thank you. So secondly, I'm to talk about prevention of HIV spreading. The important perspective in this debate, what is the incentive of HIV holders in the sexual intercourses? They simply said that criminality will deter people from exposing HIV to other people, but they ignore our characterizations from Prime Minister. We told you in many cases, even though they have full incentive to prevent HIV from spreading, for example, when you use a condom, it's still they are going to fail in sometimes that is going to transmit diseases to other people. So even though they have full incentive to prevent diseases, its incentive doesn't solve the problem in the first place. And also we concerned in many sexual intercourses are happening in a non-rational context. For example, when you're drinking in that tentative sensation, we don't think that criminality is going to change the incentive of characters of individual to that extent, to prevent transmission of diseases, so forth. And also we told you from Prime Minister how we can incentivize individuals to pay attention to HIV by their self-responsibility. Because in their side, the people act on the premise people don't commit a crime. That's why they are going to be exposed to HIV even though they irrationally committed sexual intercourse with someone. But in outside the house, they have to take responsibility by themselves. They have to pay attention whether or not their partners are HIV, whether or not their partners are correctly using the measure to prevent HIV from spreading. Within those self-responsibility is going to protect people more in outside the house. That's a unique mechanism happening in outside the house. So before my next case, yes.
Self-responsibility is based onto the assumption of self-code of morality. How is this any more different when it's established by the court as law?
Because we are talking about in a court cases when there is such malicious cases. For example, if you know you're HIV patients and you don't tell you have the HIV, and even though, for example, the partners are going to prevent the HIV, partners are rejecting measure to prevent HIV. There are kind of malicious cases, for example, existing in society. That's why in those cases, they are going to civil court and they can sue their partners in the civil courts in order to, for example, require a remedy or require compensation. But it's not that different in case of criminality. That should be imposed everyone fairly, as my partner have already told you. So lastly, about the protection of rights of holders. So first of all, let's deal with the case that lately coming from leader of opposition. So they told us that victims will lose a platform to campaign for HIV, supporting the HIV services. But we told you how this policy is unfairly stigmatizing HIV patients, including victims in their words. So we contextualize this debate as many incidents to expose HIV are happening accidentally. For example, in case of the protection by condoms or other measures failing, and they didn't have any bad intent to hurt their partners. But however, they will be treated as criminals, meaning they are pushed to the same category with other criminals, like those who kill someone or those who stole something or who severely damage other people. They are categorized criminally sanctioned people. This unfairly stigmatizing individual in the society, they are saying victims will be protected in their side, but it's very unrealistic because people don't see HIV patients regarding whether or not they are victim of transmission, or whether or not they have HIV inborn. When people cannot differentiate people in other cases, even though they are victims of exposure of HIV from your partner, people will treat HIV patients as potential criminals to expose HIV to other people. It's crucially stigmatized those individuals and making support decrease because it's criminal. There is a criminal sanction that is enough measure for them to prevent diseases. There is no other incentive to prevent this measure as they talked about. We say that criminal sanction should be the preventive measure for HIV diseases. We should push society to have other measures to prevent HIV and push the support in other measures without stigmatizing HIV victims and HIV patients. For all diseases, we think criminal justice system should go on our side. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Diallo, please.
Honorable Chair, I think it's crucially important to notice in this debate of how the removal of the criminal penalties onto a small group of HIV patients will bring forward future stigmatization onto the entire group, thus eroding all the efforts we've been putting in by NGOs, by the government, by all the different social groups trying to elevate, trying to raise awareness, trying to protect the rights of HIV/AIDS patients. In the HIV/AIDS patients, we think in this debate, firstly, the government bench has to defend the harder case than accidental transmission, because a lot of times you do see HIV patients maliciously transmitting disease to others, knowing that sexual discourse means that my partner eventually will be HIV positive in a lifetime, irreversible to the outcomes or the pills that opening government gives you. But secondly, in opening government's case, they at minimum gives legitimacy to harmful actions done to a distinct group, by a distinct group of individuals. It means that the government is literally telling the public that it's okay for HIV patients to exert and inflict harm onto others regardless of how severe the harm is. The policy of opening opposition was clear and unresponded by them. We tell you firstly, it is because that obvious and significant impact onto specific individuals. This is why we give them penalty. You have a clear criminal intent in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases transmitted. You have an explicit criminal outcome because you transfer a particular disease that is irreversible to another individual, and particularly because that disease is currently discriminated and stigmatized in the society. But thirdly, motion size exposure, it means that as long as you are able to expose your partner to that disease, regardless of the outcome, we're going to criminalize you. It means that we're not talking about the very end, we're including a very spectrum of scenarios. The scenario, the moment when you start trying to expose your partner to such disease, we think is not fine. But the second layer of the opposition model is that we tell you currently welfare for HIV patients are already in place. It means that, for example, I give you examples of the Chinese government giving entirely free medication to HIV/AIDS patients and also protect your privacy exactly because we understand the sufferings that you have gone through. We understand how it is difficult for you to live your life. We give you that policies. Currently, there are multiple forces at play to help HIV/AIDS patients. We don't think how they're we don't understand how they're going to make situations better. But then they say, firstly, you have a selected group of individuals that does not qualify for criminalization. They say the patients are innocent. They say they're accidental exposures. The question is, firstly, a lot of times we're not selecting you based upon who you are or your ability to transmit. We're selecting because of your criminal intention and criminal action. But secondly, in this debate, your innocence because you're HIV positive, let's say, does not justify your action of harm. We think opening government entirely did not respond to it. But thirdly, a lot of times, the accidental exposure to HIV does not mean it is a rightful act in itself. In the status quo, you could have avoided having sexual intercourse with your partner if it's true that you are in a loving relationship and you feel like this person is your family. We don't see how accident means that you're necessarily innocent in itself. No, thank you. But then they claim to you, firstly, people will take less preventive measures in the status quo. We think in the status quo, people don't take enough preventive measures because of the fact that people are lacking awareness or information to HIV/AIDS. It means that a lot of times they don't even realize that there's a possibility that I am, for example, in a relationship with an HIV positive patient. We think it's more likely on our side when we think it's not mutually exclusive between both sides. When you both can have awareness campaigns, when you both can have information delivered to individuals, how is that going to be more beneficial to government side? But then they say, right, when you get news out, no thank you, that a particular HIV patient is being, let's say, prosecuted because of this action, you have more stigmatization. This is false. Because firstly, you can intentionally, as a media, not make a fuss about it. We don't think it's likely for the media to accuse a particular HIV patient and say this person, because of the fact this person has HIV, this person is evil. But secondly, a lot of times it's more likely to have a future stigmatization when you see on CNN that the news title says that transmittance is no longer seen as harm. It's more likely for individuals and society to interpret this as a message of such actions can be something that is okay and to be inflicted by this particular group. No, thank you. This is why I'm going to firstly talk about why you have further stigmatization of HIV/AIDS patients. We think this is something very obvious. On the first layer, you stigmatize HIV patients who are well-intended. It means that we're talking about HIV patients who do not want to harm others, who want to be as let's say, functional as an average citizen. In their scenario, the moment when you further that particular stigmatization, the effect is onto the entire group instead of individuals who have that criminal intention. We think this is unfair in the first place. But secondly, their policy, as I've outlined before, encourages people to take even more marginalizing action because of the fact that they understand particular criminal actions will not be prosecuted. The state does not want to prosecute criminal actions done to people. The state does not want to prosecute the fact, or no thank you, criminalize the fact that another individual is actively inflicting harm onto me. We think at this moment it's more likely for us to have further marginalization because of this policy, yes.
So if the bar for criminal sanction is exposure, you can't differentiate between malicious transmission and not. So you prevent all HIV patients from having sex if you want this.
No, madam. At this moment, we think it's more likely for us to have, let's say, victims of that particular exposure to come up and say, my partner was actively trying to have sex with me without condom, which is very easy to clarify in scenarios. And a lot of times, because HIV positive patients through sexual intercourse is a lot more likely, no thank you, to transmit that particular disease to others. We think evidence is easy to be found. No thank you. But the second layer of my analysis, I'm going to tell you why this hinders so far affirmative action efforts in the status quo. In the status quo, we think their first, I have clarified that their policy gives out a message that it's okay to inflict irreversible harm onto other individuals when you are an HIV patient. But this is particularly damaging to the already shaking narrative, the shaking image of the community of HIV patients. It means that in the status quo, people associate harmful intentions or harmful actions with HIV patients. In the status quo, you want to proliferate the awareness that HIV does not mean it is immediately transmitted. HIV does not mean that these patients are evil people who always want to do harm to others. We think that particular association is going to be strengthened by this policy because of the fact that people now view this as something extremely ambiguous and strenuous in itself. In the very end, we also told you that conservatives is more likely under their policy to weaponize this particular fact and narrative to wage more objection to the efforts that we've been doing to de-associate and de-link the particular the narratives that's being waging against and discriminating HIV/AIDS patients. At this moment, opening opposition told you how this criminal action and intention itself is morally culpable. We've told you how further stigmatization is more likely to appear on our side. We told you status quo better defends HIV/AIDS patients. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much. That concludes the open house. I'd like to invite the member of government.
Madam Chair, we tell you that the ultimate reason that freed HIV patients from their shackles over the past years and And the bastion behind the normalization that actually happened is the fact that individuals no longer view these people as a direct existential threat to themselves, but rather as people who deserve their sympathy, a vulnerable group, and that's the ultimate reason why society puts so much collective resource behind these movements to help these guys. We posit to you that with criminalization, this is taken away to a very large extent, uniquely coming from closing government. So 3 main areas of extension. One, why ultimately, the ultimate reason why there is so much infrastructure and so much structural reasons for helping these people is because they are not seen as an existential threat, and how this organic change has been taken away with the implementation and focus on criminality of these people, why that would change. Secondly, we'll talk about how the incentive structure of people who have sexual intercourse actually are, and why deterrence is not something that goes into their psyche at the point of which they're having sex and transmitting HIV. Thirdly, we'll talk about principally, in terms of the CJS, why this is not right. But before that, 2 things to make clear, right? One, we believe that this act just criminalizes exposing people to HIV, does not necessarily criminalize a person who has HIV, but the act of sexual intercourse by a person who has HIV, right? Notice that biologically, if a person has sexual intercourse and has HIV, the chances are around 3 to 5% whereby the disease would be transmitted to another individual, which means there's no certain outcome out of the act that they criminalize that causes the harm that these guys want to cause, right? Second layer is that HIV is inherently something that's really hard to detect, right? Given that the individual, after having HIV, has a short-term period where they have flu-like symptoms, right? After which there's around 4 years of latency until symptoms of HIV actually start to appear, and it gradually turns into AIDS, right? That means within that time there are people capable of transmitting these things, but have no real motive or no real understanding even of the fact that they could have HIV and they could be transmitting to people that they have sexual intercourse with during that long time, right? So we posit to you, under these 2 clarifications, the debate immediately becomes clear. Why are victims harmed? Firstly, rebuttals will be integrated. They talked about how essentially there would be no harming of victims under that side of the house because people would get behind these efforts such as the Chinese government and other people. We heard that it's not true. Because the point at which you criminalize the act of spreading HIV, you see these victims or these people with HIVs as someone who is a potential spreader of this disease to other people of the community, which means you single them out as someone who is sort of leprechous to a certain extent if you compare it back to the diseases of the old days, and someone which your community wants to isolate from because you believe that they have a chance of spreading this disease to you, and you might be the next victim of this social isolation and this stigma that society puts to you, right? That means, for example, even if governments or NGOs at their best case want to help these people, their funding will be limited because it's hard to get collective action behind these people to help them, right? These people who are viewed as potential criminals that spread this disease and harm society in general. It would be much harder to get, for example, knowledge programs and get people to buy into the narrative that these people are actually victims that deserve to be protected, right? It's very hard to get interaction with these people to understand their situation, given, for example, when Magic Johnson first had HIV, no one wanted to shake his hand exactly because of the misunderstanding that it would occur. This also causes overgeneralization and flaring up of these misunderstandings, right? For example, once criminality is involved, which means the state is condoning and sanctioning this as something that's harmful to society as a whole. It sends a beacon signal that society should reject these individuals because they have a potential to harm others around them, which means people who have HIV will inherently be stigmatized and labeled as a threat to other people, and that's where the sympathy cuts off, right? Because individuals are inherently self-interest, right? The sympathy and the ability they have to help others is only weighed against how this help actually affects themselves, right? The point at which they think these people are actually threats, they will not be so willing to fork up their own resources, their capital, or their ability to get behind these movements, even if they exist to help them, right? We posit to you the outcome would be way, way worse for these victims that they want to protect on that side of the house, exactly because they're seen as potential criminals, and exactly because now the state condones and labels them as a threat to society, right? All the collective action they want is gone. Opening.
When you remove criminalization in the status quo, it doesn't mean that stigma will go away. It means a higher degree of stigma because people now know that the harms inflicted will not be punished even.
The reason why criminalization takes away stigma is this. It's because individuals will now not see HIV as a harm so great as an existential threat to them, right? A harm that causes death, by shaking hands, for example. It means that people will focus attention on things like recent advances in technology that justify why this is not criminalized, right? Because the state will explain and the legislature will debate about these things in terms of passing these bills and say, hey, recently HIV has, for example, through NIPIs or NTPIs actually has more improvement in terms of stalling the latency period, for example. For example, these guys actually live much more normal lives than you think. For example, interacting with these guys normally, we get rid of that, which is exactly our second point in my extension, right? Which is that this allows for more discourse on a normal level because the government has to justify why decriminalization actually happens, right? The government will tell you and posit to you how these guys are actually not as big of a threat to society as it becomes, which means the discourse and the social movements will now revolve around these individuals and we recognize that they're actually not that big of a threat to society, right? You see how, for example, example, people will now gear behind them because they feel sympathy to these people. There will be much more collective action movements. There will be much more networks and support structures for these people. There will be more interaction, for example, when these people are asked to speak in legislatures and to give their opinions on how it's like being an HIV person and how we can help them. We argue it's much better on our side of the house, right? Second layer of extension, very briefly, why deterrence won't work. They talked about why deterrence is so important, but we posit to you it's false. Why? We say inherently in the time of which an individual is about to have sexual intercourse, the last thing in his mind is a rational calculus of whether or not he'll be criminalized by the act. Right? Given that sexual intercourse and sexual need is something primal and emotive to the extent that it takes away rational discourse. Right? You also posit to you that in many situations, for example, when people are drunk or not really know what they're doing, this sort of deterrence has no effect on these people anyways, right? Because they might not be able to process the fact that they're having sexual intercourse in the first place, right? More importantly, on their side of the house, we see people who have even less of an incentive to tell people that they have HIV. Why? Because the ultimate destruction it does to your identity as an individual and your social circle, the point at which society labels you as a threat to them, right? That means people who willingly tell their partner they have HIV will lose missing that partner, and that effect trickles down to other social circles they have, right? Other interactions they have in daily life, and causes such a bad effect that we argue people would rather run the chance that the 3 to 5% rate of infection does not happen, and rather not tell people that they have HIV due to the huge consequences that come from that. People, like normal criminals, would rather assume that the crime will be made up perfectly, assume that there will be no HIV transmitted, that's why they won't get caught red-handed, right? Thirdly, and very briefly on the criminal justice system. One, we say that it's unjust to criminalize something when the outcome is not uncertain, right? For example, we don't criminalize lifestyle choices like eating many McDonald's, although the outcome is bad, which is cancer, and it has a marked increase in causing that outcome, right? Because ultimately, a 3 to 5% chance of causing this thing is not something that's worthy to be criminalized by the state, as there's no causative factor to be proved the time at which you do this, right? Also, we say, for example, in terms of tracking back partners, given the long latency period of HIV, and the fact that many individuals might not even know that they have HIV in the first place, there's no criminal motive that these guys talk about for the state to justify prosecution, right? We tell you that ultimately, given state sanction is so disproportionately inflicted on these individuals, and the stigma we painted to you in terms of society and the state in the whole, and the fact they lack all support networks, we say that ultimately it's not justified for them to criminalize this act, right? Therefore, on both levels, CG uniquely gives you context and extension on how this affects the victims they want to protect, and also HIV patients. We are beyond proud to propose the motion.
Just give me a second.
Yep.
All right, thank you so much. Inviting the member of opposition.
Here, here.
Madam Speaker, fundamental fault that's perpetuating the government have as a whole is their wrong characterization as to opening government telling me that HIV is not so much of a threat anymore because of modern technology, and then closing government tells us that the transmission rate is 5 to 3%, therefore it's not much of a real danger. Couple factual check here. Recently, there's been a case where in Busan, one prostitute who had HIV, knowing and she knew she had HIV, continuously had, did her business, and also in an unprotected manner, ended up resulting infecting 80 people. Under closing government's characterization, I suppose she had a lot of sex with a lot of different people, or a lot of sex with those 80 people. I don't think that's quite likely, especially given that HWO tells us that AIDS is one of the most contagious diseases that we have in the world. I don't buy that 3 to 5% characteristic. Neither should you, Madam Speaker. Second of all, they tell us that because of this modern medicine, we eventually it's not so bad. You can live longer and things like that. Still, the fact is, it is an incurable disease that will inevitably lead to your death. We think that in and of itself, regardless of the fact that there are mitigating factors, still, you have doomed this person to a life of medication that are also costly, and also that kind of life of stigmatization that you conceded. We think that there is a certain level of criminality. Opening government tries to take a soft line, telling us that we can make this into a civil case. One thing, the difference between civil liability and criminal liability and civil court and criminal court is that civil court is about property damage that are quantifiably measurable, Madam Speaker. It tells you we should recompensate the people. You're going to tell me you're going to be able to calculate the damages done by transmission of HIV and then therefore compensate? I don't really think so. We're going to tell you why it's justified, even if it's not really onto your fault of even if in these kind of cases why it should be criminalized. It is consistent within the current system of criminal justice system and so on and so forth. But a couple of responses. Opening government tells us that you might do this accidentally and you might take all the precautionary measure and you might still infect this person and that person shouldn't be punished. We completely agree. We think that if you did take all the preventative measure possible, then you can prove that into a court, then you have proven that you did not knowingly knowingly expose this person to a disease, right? We think that when you simply say that these people are getting wrongly persecuted because they simply engage in sexual activity is a wrong characterization that runs away from the debate. Shame on you. Second of all, they tell us that these people and both opening and closing. So not so much for extension. Sit down, sir. They tell us that in this kind of sexual intercourse, rationality is not something you can expect from them. Madam Speaker, I think that if you are in possession of a very deadly disease that will, as I told you, inevitably lead to your premature death, we think that we can demand that kind of responsibility and that kind of rationality. They tell us that, what if you were drunk? Well, you're drunk driving and you hit someone, you are criminally liable. Completely no ground coming from closing government. That's why they should get bored. Now, onto our exclusive material. First of all, I'm going to actually vertically extend opening up opposition in terms of their dichotomization of victims and perpetrators. Opening up already told you how this can separate the bad HIV people with malicious intent and good HIV people who are trying to do, as opening government tells us, trying to do their best to protect their loved ones and other people around them, right? We're telling you that right now, despite the government effort into helping these people in terms of welfare and whatnot, there is a still significant public resentment toward these people, and these kind of policies are constantly under attack in Congress, right? We're going to tell you how we're going to fix that. And that's the exclusive contribution coming from closing opposition. Sit down, sir. We think that this can actually happen because by telling the people that we are going to isolate the bad ones from the good one, and people who are still running about in the society, one, has a clear incentive to be self-responsible, which is unique, which is something that government side does not possess, and two, these people have not done anything wrong. These people are probably safe to go around, and therefore it allows the people to actually be more favorable towards better policies and better welfare system and better communication and better education that it will eventually reduce the stigma onto their part, right? Secondly, the opening government told you how on their side they actually worsen the stigma. I'm going to tell you how criminalization can actually reduce the stigma of fear of HIV positive patients. The fact is, you have to understand the characterization here is that the reason why people are afraid of HIV positive people is that one, we don't know who they are, and two, they might infect us, right? And the fact is that if you remove the deterrence factor from these people, it makes it more likely that these people might infect me. It increases the awareness of danger that I'm under. That increases my incentive to persecute these people even further and create even bigger stigmatization. We think that's not actually helping these people in the end. Even under the best case scenario, when they talk about a little bit later, even under their best case scenario where they tell us that these people are trying to take best measure, and then we don't want them. These people probably don't want because they don't want their loved ones. Actually, I'm gonna do that. Okay. So, secondly, we're going to tell you that actually increasing the gravity of HIV is actually even beneficial, even better. Why is that so? Because right now there are people who, exactly as you characterized, people with HIV that do go around irresponsibly in terms of infecting other people with HIV. We think that when government actually takes a strong stance that this is a bad thing, this is morally incorrect, and this is something that you should have been responsible for, and this is something that you should have been responsible for. It sends a strong message that the government actually sees the situation as sees this situation as a threat and therefore impose more self-responsibility. Lastly, Madam Speaker, I'm going to tell you why this is actually in accordance to, for example, criminal negligence. They tell us that we couldn't possibly foresee this, whatever. We're going to tell you in the current system of criminal justice system, we already have a system of criminal negligence. What does this mean? It means that if you as an individual cause harm to another individual cause harm to another individual despite the predictability of a harm happening, and we tell you engaging in sexual intercourse unprotected is pretty predictable harm, I suppose. You not taking action in and of itself is a crime, Madam Speaker. Therefore, when they tell us that we need to have stricter measures, we already showed you by telling you about the criminalization. We already told you that this precisely works in accordance with the current system of criminal justice. So at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, how are we supposed to educate? Closing opposition was the one that told you direct impact of this policy as to by separating and dichotomizing these people, what kind of change in narrative, and therefore better policies from the government can happen. Two, we told you how by eliminating the fear factor, by increasing the deterrence, and therefore assumption of more precautionary measure, we actually decrease the stigmatization. At the end of the day, at the end of the day, because we're the one that told you these things, proud to oppose.
Alright, thank you so much. Inviting the government.
I would first like to recharacterize some of the issues that CEO has brought forth. Right? So one, in medical school, we learned that if needle stick injury, you have a 3 in 1,000 chance of getting infected with AIDS. Right? With sexual intercourse, it's 3 in 100. Yeah. They bring example of 80 people infected in Busan prostitute. We think that is the exact news that we're talking about, that over-sensationalizes and over-generalizes the entire issue, that thinks that AIDS is incredibly dangerous and therefore you are never being able to do that. We say that these are the sources of stigmatization. These sort of news that gains attention in national media are the news that we are fighting against, and that's why we are having this motion right now. Right? They've talked about how, they've talked about somehow if you do oral protection, it is fine. We think that is a principal inconsistency with the side where they are saying that, if you're intentional, then it's not okay, right? So we think that they need to resolve that inconsistency. Right? In the example of drunk driving, right, we see that there is a significant difference between drunk driving and AIDS, right? For one, that we say that the cognitive decline in function leads to 100% of you driving unsafe, right? We see that there is a fundamental difference from that to what we're talking about when there's a 3 to 5% and you cannot change the status of like being an HIV member, right? Yeah. We're talking about when you're drunk driving, you have the chance, you have the option of not being drunk, right? We say that in HIV, it doesn't afford you the same protection, right? And thirdly, we don't say that you stigmatize a drunk driver for life, right? If you do not drink while driving, you do not stigmatize that person, right? We say that being in HIV is a fundamental part of your identity, and therefore you are stigmatizing that person, not one's action, right? We think that that is a major difference. But let's talk more about deterrence, right? Why it is a myth. Because one, we've analyzed to you the nature of HIV explicitly, by side government, right? Side closing government. So we talked to you about how one, it's 1 in 30 odds of getting caught, and two, on how there's a large prevalence in, let's say, African countries where around 15% of the population has AIDS in the first place, right? So we say that when combined with a 3 to 5% infection rate, it's incredibly hard to actually catch the people, right? And we say that it's incredibly hard to prove the people getting AIDS as well, right? So we say that this deterrence effect is actually just a myth of saying that, someone will get caught, but in reality, a lot of people actually go free. And we think that HIV people actually, those who know that, right? Secondly, we also find that it is very hard to find out who is exactly responsible, right? We say that there are a lot of other ways of transmitting HIV. For example, bloodborne illnesses like selling blood and so on, right? We say that these needle hole injections can also lead to HIV, right? So it's incredibly hard to determine whether your AIDS is caused by your sexual partner or whatnot, right? And therefore, we think that the deterrence effect significantly is lowered due to the hardness, due to the level of difficulty of prosecuting these crimes, right? So in reality, we say that this deterrence only provides a false sense of security. It doesn't really change anything in the current status quo. Secondly, they also didn't deal with our analysis of being, our characterization of those people in sexual relations being not really irrational in the first place, and does not really calculate whether I would get caught when going through that sexual act, when we say that it's oftentimes a crime of passion. But secondly, they've also never dealt with our criminal justice system uniquely brought forth by closing opposition. And secondly, more importantly, we've also talked about the rehabilitation of HIV patients. Again, not really dealt with closing opposition later, right? We've talked to you about how it changes the perception and stigmatization of that particular individual. When we say three things, right? We say that perception is shaped by one, the media, right? Because we say that when cases of criminality, such as that Busan prostitute that they've talked about, we sensationalize them, right? Even we say, if, let's say, the report was sympathetic to those AIDS patients, the existence of such a punishment, the existence of such a law, means that the reception will be tainted by law, right? The moment you perceive that news information, you think back on, oh, that is still illegal. Like people, we still need to protect ourselves from these HIV people. We say that it taints the perception of these information, right? And then we say that understand furthermore, many people have a simplistic analysis on moral, moral analysis, right? When they say that the law is against something, they think that something is wrong, right? We think that a lot of people in the society does that, right? For example, in Hong Kong, the umbrella movement, just because it's illegal, many people equate it with being wrong, and therefore a lot of people are against it, like occupying streets and so on, right? Just because it is wrong, and they do not consider the further aspects of whether the HIV person is like transmitted by birth or so on, the moral implications of it, and so on, right? We think that these clear analysis doesn't really come through, right? But secondly, also talk about real life examples, right? When you actually see someone who has HIV being jailed for being HIV and transmitting it to someone else, we think that that creates a very visceral impact when you see someone getting, or someone other people know getting jailed. Right? We say that this certainly reinforces the message that they are a threat. They are someone who we do not want to engage with, right? We say that they're talking, like their analysis had talked about, resentment and disagreement, because you separate guilty from innocent, and therefore that's fine. One, my analysis already dealt with that you cannot separate the guilty from innocent because a lot of people do not get caught in the first place. And therefore the innocent will also be thought of as guilty, right? And secondly, those who are guilty might not be guilty in the first place. But secondly, they're talking about, then they will not be afraid that they will infect us. We say that that is wrong, but before I go on, yes.
So when we talk about those the sensationalization media, if people find out that this woman was not punished, how is it going to improve the perception of these people that are spreading it?
The problem is we think that there is no way to prove that that particular woman does create the AIDS. Right? But secondly, we say that it creates further incentive for you to educate. Make sure the education is effective. Right? We say that it garners public pressure for them to actually have an effective education instead of just having that punishment and saying that that punishment will be enough of a deterrent to actually stop them. Right? Because we think deterrence is useless and the only way is education. And under our status quo, our education will be better than under their side. Right? But secondly, they say that it increases awareness and so on. We say that right now, under this circumstance, we say that when Yao Ming promotes having handshakes with AIDS patients, it's precisely because people are even afraid to have a handshake with them. Yeah. People are afraid to exchange saliva with them, like kissing. A lot of people think that it transmits HIV/AIDS, although it takes 2 liters of saliva to actually transmit AIDS. Right? We say that these kinds of misperceptions will still persist under their status quo when they think that, the innocent will be there, right? Because they have AIDS, and the perception itself is that they are threatening, they are harmful, regardless of whether they're innocent or guilty or whether their actions actually transmit, right? A simple handshake will not transmit HIV, but the sad perception is that we need a governmental advertisement to make people understand that it is actually safe to interact normally with HIV patients, and that is why we stand for HIV patients. We stand in opposite support of the motion. Thank you.
Alright, thank you so much for inviting the opposite.
Okay, let's clear at least one thing. If your assertion is both that you think HIVs are not really that dangerous or yet contagious, but at the same time we do need to spread the notion that you need to be careful of it, at least choose one. Because if it's not that serious, what's the real necessity of you trying to spread a necessary notion of awareness of HIV being so serious, so contagious, so dangerous, or whatnot? We're not scientists in this debate, so maybe it's really, really hard for us to contaminate on an objective stance of what's really, really harmful for your healthy life or anything, but at least I believe in one standard. WHO established that one of the most dangerous, and one of the most awareness that we need to give as a disease is HIV and AIDS. If that sense, with that criteria at least given, let's try to move on to this days. 4 criteria that we're going to go through. Number 1, criminal liability, how do we prove it? Number 2, stigmatization, how does it work better for either side? Number 3, how do we make better education and research? And number 4, what's at least the worst world but yet the better world compared to government when opposition tries to come up with this? Let's go first. Criminal liability, I have 5 things about this. Number 1, about the impact, I already talked about why the impact is given to society. Since WHO, a lot of prestigious institutions notify that this has a critical impact to the life of an individual, we do have impact to an individual as a victim. That's also a justification of criminal liability. Second, about the mistakes of opening government's case, we already talked about why that mistake is so minor, that's really a landslide mischaracterization. But even if, let's try to take that mistakes might be possible. We're going to bite the bullet and say, if it's going to be a 0.1 percentage of a mistake, we're going to say that that percent might be also possible to criminal punishment, even if, because law is about a collective approach to a society that would cover up a general sense of a society measure when it comes to criminal liability. So even if that minor case is possible, you need to prove why that minor case is so important that it could override all of the majority cases that are possible that we can possibly criminally punish other people. Third, about negligence that was never really responded by either team. Even if we would try to bite the bullet of all of these cases from government bench in total, that an individual might not know as much, an individual might not have malicious intent. Opening opposition talked about intent. Closing opposition talked about much more about the idea of negligence, because if you have the ability of prediction, even if you don't have active approach and activities in that sense, the fact that you predicted a fact and you didn't put on action is also a reason of why you can be criminally liable. Fourth, crime of passion. Crime of passion is not a reason of why you can't be criminally liable. Second degree murder is also out of crime of passion. That's also still a liability justification. Therefore, that's not really your case. Lastly, about informed choice, Gov bench in total, people aren't informed, people don't really know. The justification of when you are punished based on information is basically this. When you have intent, they never really prove why intent isn't given, but when you have state education, because of that, you are under the assertion and the premise as a government that you now have all of the information and education that you can possibly persecute outside of the society, therefore we give you responsibility-wise. Afterwards, that's the reason why we don't prosecute people who are still in elementary school because they didn't go through state education yet. Since you are after that, you have state responsibility. You have your rights, now you have your responsibility. That's why criminal liability is possible. But let's talk a bit more about stigmatization. This was really weird. As closing opposition agreed, if you are a drunk driver in past, the way of how you get away from that stigmatization is to not drunk drive again. That's exactly what we're saying. If you are a criminal because you knowingly expose someone by HIV, the way of how you escape that is to not have non-safe sex anymore. But let's try to characterize this a bit more. Deterrence fact is what our closing opposition came up as a really unique matter. And the fact of the matter, of the reason and the fundamental root of why people start to stigmatize is because they're exposed by personal danger. Likewise, by not knowing the possibility of when they might be exposed, but more importantly, even if they were exposed, they don't have any defense measure by a state level afterwards, they have much more reasons of why they would lead on to an emotion of stigmatization in order to secure themselves. That's the reason why deterrence becomes even more important by giving state level and therefore give less reasons of a fundamental of why we need to stigmatize people. Public sentiments work also by us because it now shows that as the majority public, if they would see an incident of someone exposing HIV to another person, but no punishment happens, it rather becomes much more reasons of why they notify that there can't be any help anymore. But even if let's try to take that as a deadlock, like stigmatization happens from both case scenarios from both houses, right? In the end, everyone wants better education and better approaches of research. Nonetheless, 3 teams don't talk about how it happens on a likely status and a mechanism. Closing opposition bid. This is why we're first. Number 1, onto the incidence of how and usually why you would start education and research is because a government puts a stance of a policy in order to subsidize those kind of activities. How does that happen? It basically happens by 2 things. Number 1, when you establish a punishment based onto individuals of a public, it means that you're putting on responsibility. Responsibility comes with an additional reason of why governments need to give much more help, and therefore give much more justifications or reasons of why a government needs to establish much more policies or much more subsidizations to research, to educations, to the public, in order for them to be informed to the level that they are going to also be exposed to possibilities of responsibility. But more importantly, second of all, if a law is established, as everyone agreed in this bench, public awareness also goes up. If public awareness also goes up, there's more reasons for a government to take care of this incident. Therefore, take more reasons of why education and research should be subsidized and concentrated. That's why we give you the mechanisms much more likely on CO. Last case. Let's take the case that much more be the worst case scenario possible for CO. In a situation that education, all these kind of stuff don't work, criminally we might be putting someone unjustifiably liable, at least what we get is victim closure. We get to save the person who was exposed to a harm that is left out from a society and gains nothing as help, or possibly very minimal. At least what we do as a punishment, we give them the emotional support by the government that you're not alone, and you can prosper from the society. We don't isolate them, we take them with us. We think that's how you eradicate all of these hatreds. We're proud to oppose.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you for the debate. Please cross the floor.
We're doing it for you.